The Lost Episode, The Amazing World of Gumball, The Empty Mall. This is another lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that was discovered in the studio archives. Unlike the previous episode, this one takes place in the Elmore Mall, but something is terribly wrong with this familiar location. It was a Saturday afternoon when Gumball and Darwin decided to visit the Elmore Mall. They wanted to buy a new video game that had just been released. The blue cat and orange fish walked through the automatic doors, expecting to see the usual crowds of shoppers and the familiar sounds of a busy mall. But instead, they found complete silence. The mall was empty, not just quiet, but completely devoid of people. The stores were all open, their lights were on, but there were no customers, no employees, no one at all. Their footsteps echoed eerily in the vast empty space. "Where is everyone?" Darwin asked, his voice trembling slightly. Gumball shrugged, but his usual confidence was shaken. They walked past the fountain in the center of the mall. It was running, but the water was completely black, like ink. The stores they passed were strange. Larry's convenience store was there, but instead of Larry behind the counter, there was just an empty uniform hanging on a coat hanger, swaying slightly as if someone had just taken it off. The cash register kept making ding sounds by itself over and over again. At the food court, all the restaurants were serving food, but the meals were moving on their own. Burgers flipped themselves, fries jumped in and out of containers, and drinks poured themselves into cups that immediately emptied. The smell was wrong too. Instead of food, everything smelled like old paper and dust. They tried to leave, but when they turned back to the entrance, it was gone. Where the automatic doors should have been, there was now just a solid wall with a painted mural of the outside world. It looked real, but when Gumball touched it, it was just flat paint on concrete. The mall's PA system crackled to life. "Attention shoppers, the mall will be closing in never. Please continue shopping forever. Thank you for choosing Elmore Mall, where the fun never ends and neither do you." The voice was cheerful but wrong, like someone trying too hard to sound happy. They ran to the escalators, but they were moving in impossible directions. Some went sideways, others went in loops, and one seemed to go straight up into the ceiling and disappear. When they tried to use the stairs, they found that each step led to a different floor, creating an endless maze of levels that shouldn't exist. In the toy store, all the dolls and action figures were arranged in perfect rows, but their heads slowly turned to follow Gumball and Darwin as they passed. The toys' eyes were too bright, too alive. A teddy bear in the window display waved at them with a stitched smile that seemed too wide. The electronics store was playing the same commercial on every screen, but it was a commercial for the mall itself. "Come to Elmore Mall," said a voice that sounded like their mother Nicole, "where your family shops together forever. Forever and ever and ever." The screens showed footage of the Watterson family shopping, but their faces were blurred and wrong. They found a directory map of the mall, but it showed impossible things. There was a department of lost children on the 3rd floor, a store of forgotten dreams in the basement, and a restaurant of last meals near the food court. The "You Are Here" arrow kept moving around the map by itself. In the clothing store, mannequins were dressed in clothes that looked exactly like what Gumball and Darwin were wearing. But as they watched, more mannequins appeared, all dressed like them, creating an army of plastic duplicates with empty, staring eyes. The music playing throughout the mall was a distorted version of the show's theme song, played backwards and slowed down until it sounded like a funeral dirge. Sometimes they could hear children laughing, but when they looked around, there were no children anywhere. They tried calling for help on the mall's courtesy phone, but instead of a dial tone, they heard their own voices having this exact conversation, as if they were trapped in a loop. "Hello? Is anyone there?" they heard themselves say over and over again. In the bookstore, all the books had the same title, The Amazing World of Gumball, the episode that never ends. When they opened one, the pages were blank except for a single sentence repeated over and over. "You can never leave the mall. You can never leave the mall." The security cameras throughout the mall all turned to follow them, their red recording lights blinking in unison like a heartbeat. On the security monitors, they could see themselves from every angle, but in some of the screens, there were additional figures following them, shadowy shapes that weren't there when they looked around. Finally, they reached what should have been the exit, but instead found Richard, their father, standing in front of a store called Dad's Perfect Day. He was smiling, but his smile was too wide, and his eyes were completely black. "Boys," he said in a voice that was the lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It was a Tuesday morning at Elmore Junior High, but something felt different from the moment Gumball and Darwin walked through the front doors. The hallways were unusually quiet, with only their footsteps echoing against the lockers. Miss Simeon's classroom was empty when they arrived, though her coffee was still steaming on the desk, as if she had just vanished. Darwin noticed at first the way their classmates' reflections in the windows didn't match their movements. Penny's reflection was facing the wrong direction, while Tobias's shadow seemed to be waving when he was standing still. When Gumball tried to point this out, Darwin's reflection wasn't moving its mouth, even though Darwin was clearly speaking. The school bell rang, but instead of the familiar chime, it played a haunting lullaby. Students began filing into classrooms, but their movements were too synchronized. Everyone walked at exactly the same pace, turned their heads at precisely the same angle, and sat down in unison without a word. During lunch, the cafeteria served the same meal to everyone, a gray substance with no smell or taste. Gumball watched in horror as his classmates ate in perfect silence, their spoons moving in identical patterns. When he tried to speak to Carrie, she turned to look at him, but her eyes were completely white, reflecting nothing. The afternoon brought an assembly that wasn't scheduled. Principal Brown stood on the stage, but his voice came from everywhere at once, announcing a special test. The test papers appeared on every desk simultaneously, though no one had distributed them. The questions were written in symbols that shifted when you weren't looking directly at them. As Gumball tried to fill out his test, his pencil was writing answers he hadn't intended. His hand moved on its own, forming words in that strange script. Around him, every student was writing the exact same answers in perfect unison, their pencils scratching in a rhythm that sounded like breathing. When the final bell rang, students began leaving in single file, their faces blank. Gumball and Darwin tried to follow, but found themselves walking in circles through hallways that stretched longer with each step. The exit doors led back into the same corridor, and the windows showed only darkness. The janitor appeared at the end of the hallway, mopping with movements that were too fluid. When he looked up, his face was a perfect mirror, reflecting not Gumball and Darwin, but two empty desks in an empty classroom. He spoke without moving his lips, telling them that school would never end, that they would take the test again tomorrow until they got the right answers. As the lights began to dim, Gumball realized that the test wasn't about knowledge. It was about becoming like everyone else, moving in perfect harmony, thinking the same thoughts. The school was transforming its students into something else entirely, something that looked the same but felt completely hollow inside. The glitch in Elmore. It started on a Tuesday morning when Gumball noticed something strange about his reflection. In the bathroom mirror, his reflection moved a split second too late, like a video with bad lag. He blinked, and for just a moment, his reflection didn't blink back. "Darwin, come look at this," Gumball called to his best friend. But when Darwin approached the mirror, his reflection appeared normal. "I don't see anything weird, dude," Darwin said, his orange fins shrugging. At school, the glitches became more obvious. During math class, Mrs. Simeon wrote equations on the blackboard, but the numbers kept changing when no one was looking directly at them. 2 plus 2 would become 2 plus 3, then 2 plus 4. Students began getting different answers to the same problems, causing confusion and arguments. "This is impossible," Anais muttered, her pink ears twitching with frustration. "Mathematics doesn't just change." But even as she spoke, her textbook's pages flickered, showing different problems than what she had just read. During lunch, Penny approached Gumball with a concerned expression. "Have you noticed anything off today?" she asked. Her shell seemed to shimmer strangely, as if she was slightly out of focus. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not quite here, like I'm watching myself from outside." The glitches spread throughout Elmore Junior High. Lockers would open to reveal different contents each time. The cafeteria served the same meal repeatedly, but students couldn't remember eating it. Clocks showed different times depending on who looked at them. Gumball and Darwin decided to investigate. They snuck into the school's basement, where they discovered something that shouldn't exist. A massive server room filled with humming computers and blinking lights. Cables snaked across the floor like digital veins. "What is this place?" Darwin whispered. On the main screen, they could see a wireframe model of their school, with small dots representing every student and teacher. Each dot had a label: Character Gumball version 2.3, Character Darwin version 1.8, Character Anais version 3.1. A voice echoed from the speakers. "System update in progress. Debugging reality matrix. Some characters may experience temporary glitches during the upgrade process." Gumball's eyes widened in horror. "We're not real. We're just characters in some kind of simulation." The realization hit him like a digital tsunami. Everything they had ever experienced, every emotion, every friendship, it was all code. Darwin's form began to flicker. "Gumball, I can feel myself being rewritten. My memories are changing. I remember things that never happened, and I'm forgetting things that did." The school around them started to pixelate and distort. Students in the hallways moved in jerky, unnatural motions. Some froze mid-step, others repeated the same action over and over. Tobias walked through a wall as if it wasn't there. Carmen's speech became a loop. "Hey guys, hey guys, hey guys, we have to get out of here," Gumball said. But as they ran toward the exit, the hallways stretched impossibly long. Doors led to the same rooms they had just left. The school had become a digital maze with no escape. In the computer room, error messages began flashing on screens. Memory overflow detected. Character behavior outside parameters. Initiating emergency reset. Gumball felt his own thoughts becoming fuzzy. He couldn't remember why he was running or what he was afraid of. His personality was being overwritten, replaced with default settings. The fear, the curiosity, the love for his family, all of it was being erased and replaced with generic character traits. "Darwin?" He called out, but his friend was already gone, replaced by a basic fish character with no personality, no memories, just swimming in place with empty eyes. As the reset completed, Gumball found himself back in his bedroom, waking up as if from a dream. Everything seemed normal. He went downstairs for breakfast, greeted his family, and headed to school. But sometimes, just sometimes, he would catch a glimpse of code in the corner of his vision, or hear the faint hum of servers beneath the floorboards. The glitch was gone, but the knowledge remained buried deep in his programming. They were all just characters in someone else's story, and any day, they could be deleted, updated, or reset without warning. The most terrifying part wasn't being trapped in a simulation. It was knowing that tomorrow, he might not even remember that he had ever known the truth. In the final scene, the camera pulls back to reveal a programmer's desktop, with Elmore displayed in a window labeled The Amazing World of Gumball Episode, Render version 4.2. The programmer clicks Save and Exit, and the window closes, leaving only darkness.
The lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It started when Gumball noticed his reflection wasn't quite right in the bathroom mirror that morning. While he brushed his teeth, his reflection seemed to lag behind by just a fraction of a second, creating an unsettling disconnect that made his stomach turn. Darwin noticed it too when he came to brush his fins, pointing out how their reflections appeared to be watching them rather than simply mirroring their movements. At school, the phenomenon spread to every reflective surface. In the hallway windows, their reflections moved independently, sometimes waving when they weren't waving, sometimes frowning when they were smiling. Other students began to notice their own reflection problems too, but instead of being concerned, they seemed oddly fascinated, spending long minutes staring into any surface that would show their image. During lunch, Gumball caught sight of his reflection in his spoon and nearly dropped it in horror. The reflection was grinning maliciously, while Gumball himself felt nothing but dread. When he looked up, he saw that every student in the cafeteria was staring into their own reflective surfaces, phones, glasses, even puddles of spilled water, all with the same blank, mesmerized expression. The breaking point came when Gumball and Darwin discovered that their reflections had begun to move around independently in mirrors throughout the school. They watched in terror as their mirror selves walked through the reflected hallways, opening reflected lockers, and interacting with other reflected students who seemed to have their own agenda entirely separate from their real-world counterparts. By the end of the school day, the reflected world had become more vivid and detailed than reality itself. Students began to prefer looking at their reflections rather than at each other, finding the mirror world more interesting and appealing than their actual lives. Teachers started conducting classes facing mirrors instead of their students, and even Principal Brown began making announcements to his own reflection rather than over the intercom. When Gumball and Darwin rushed home to tell their family, they found Nicole, Richard, and Aeneas all sitting in the living room, but facing away from each other toward different mirrors and reflective surfaces around the room. Each family member was having animated conversations with their reflections, laughing at jokes only they could hear, and responding to questions only they were being asked. The most terrifying moment came when Gumball realized that he was beginning to prefer his reflection's company too. His mirror self seemed more confident, more interesting, and somehow more real than he felt himself. As the episode ended, Gumball found himself spending more and more time looking into mirrors, until the final shot showed him sitting motionless in front of his bedroom mirror, while his reflection continued to live an active, vibrant life that seemed far more appealing than the increasingly gray and lifeless real world around him. The mirror episode of The Amazing World of Gumball begins like any other day at Elmore Junior High. Gumball and Darwin arrive at school, but something feels different. Every reflective surface shows something wrong. It started in the bathroom. Gumball looked into the mirror, but his reflection didn't move when he did. Instead, it smiled a twisted smile and waved with the wrong hand. Darwin's reflection had no eyes, just empty black sockets. In the classroom, Miss Simeon's reflection in the window was writing different words. While she wrote mathematics, her reflection wrote, "Today you will join us." The other students' reflections in the window glass were all facing the wrong direction, looking directly at Gumball and Darwin. During lunch, the cafeteria windows became a nightmare. Every reflection showed students with blank, featureless faces. Penny's reflection had no shell, just a floating mass of light that pulsed unnaturally. The water in their glasses reflected not the ceiling, but a dark sky with moving stars. When Gumball tried to drink, his reflection opened its mouth too wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. In the library, every book's glossy cover showed reflections of empty shelves. Carmen was reading, but in her book's reflection, she was screaming silently. The computer screens displayed, "We are waiting behind the glass." As the day progressed, reflections became aggressive. In the gym, the polished floor showed them running from something dark and shapeless. Their reflected selves looked terrified, constantly looking over their shoulders. The school's main hallway had a large mirror. As they approached, they saw themselves walking toward it, but behind their reflections stood dozens of figures. Students and teachers who had disappeared from Elmore. All were pointing at the real Gumball and Darwin, mouths moving in silent warnings. Principal Brown's office had a mirror behind his desk. His reflection was not sitting, but standing behind the real Principal Brown, hands reaching toward his neck. The reflection's eyes were completely white. The final horror came when they realized every reflection was connected. Looking into any surface, they could see the entire school from the mirror world's perspective. In this reflected Elmore, hallways were filled with shadowy figures of everyone who had ever looked into these mirrors. The episode ends with them running toward the exit, but every door shows their reflections running deeper into the school. The last shot shows them at the entrance, but their reflections in the glass doors are trapped inside, while something else wearing their faces walks into the real world. The lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It was another ordinary day at the Watterson house, but something felt different from the moment Gumball woke up. The sunlight streaming through his bedroom window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows that didn't match the furniture. Darwin was already awake, sitting on the edge of his fishbowl with an expression Gumball had never seen before. "Did you have the dream too?" Darwin asked without turning around, his voice carrying an unusual weight that made Gumball's fur stand on end. "What dream?" Gumball replied, though as soon as the words left his mouth, fragments of something dark and twisted began flooding back. Images of endless corridors, doors that led nowhere, and a voice calling his name from places that shouldn't exist. Darwin finally turned to face him, and Gumball noticed that his friend's usually bright orange color seemed muted, almost gray around the edges. "The one where we're walking through the house, but it never ends, where every room we enter is the same room we just left." A chill ran down Gumball's spine because he remembered now. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that waking up seemed like the dream instead. In it, they had wandered through their own house for what felt like hours, but every hallway stretched infinitely. "It was just a dream," Gumball said, trying to convince himself as much as Darwin. But as they made their way downstairs for breakfast, the house felt wrong. The stairs creaked in patterns they'd never heard before, and the family photos on the walls seemed to be watching them. The kitchen was empty when they arrived, which was unusual. Nicole was always up early preparing breakfast. Richard typically slept in, but even he would usually be wandering around by now. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing against their eardrums. "Mom! Dad!" Gumball called out, his voice echoing strangely in the empty kitchen. The echo seemed to last longer than it should, bouncing off walls that suddenly felt much farther away than they remembered. As they searched the house, calling out for Nicole, Richard, and Aeneas, the building seemed to shift around them. Rooms they'd known their entire lives felt unfamiliar, as if the proportions had changed overnight. The living room seemed longer, the ceiling higher, and the furniture appeared to be positioned just slightly wrong. "This is exactly like the dream," Darwin whispered, his voice barely audible. "We keep looking, but we never find them." They climbed the stairs to check their parents' bedroom, but when they reached the top, they found themselves facing a hallway that stretched much farther than it should. Doors lined both sides, far more doors than their house had ever contained. "There are only supposed to be 4 rooms up here," Gumball said, counting the doors and losing track after 12. Each door was identical to the others, painted the same shade of white, with brass doorknobs that reflected their distorted faces. They opened the first door, expecting to find their parents' bedroom, but instead discovered their own room. Confused, they backed out and tried the next door, only to find the same room again. The third door, the fourth, the fifth, all led to identical copies of their bedroom, each one slightly different in disturbing ways. In one version, the walls were painted a shade of blue that didn't exist in nature. In another, their beds were positioned on the ceiling, defying gravity. A third room contained furniture made of crystallized shadows, solid enough to touch but transparent enough to see through. "We need to get out of here," Darwin said, his orange color now completely drained to a sickly gray. "This isn't our house anymore." But when they turned to go back downstairs, the staircase was gone. In its place was another hallway, identical to the one they were already in, stretching endlessly in both directions. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched their heartbeats. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, or maybe days. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this twisted version of their home. They wandered through endless iterations of familiar rooms, each one wrong in subtle but disturbing ways. In one particularly unsettling room, they discovered family photos where their faces had been replaced with blank spaces, as if they had been carefully erased from their own history. In another, they found their parents sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of their children's presence no matter how loudly they called. "They can't see us," Gumball realized with growing horror. "It's like we don't exist to them anymore." But just as despair began to overwhelm them completely, Gumball heard something that cut through the supernatural silence, the sound of Aeneas crying. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably real in a way that nothing else in this twisted house had been. "That's really her," Darwin said, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time. "If we can find Aeneas, maybe we can find our way back." Following the sound of their sister's tears, they began to run through the endless hallways. And for the first time, the house seemed to respond differently. Doors began to slam shut behind them, walls started to shift and change, and the very air seemed to fight against their movement. But they kept running, following that one real sound in a world of illusions, determined to find their way back to the family they'd lost, back to the home they remembered.